Hi folks, we're going to talk about how states organize their governments, and you should take a second to set up your notes. We're going to talk about three specific topics as soon as this loads. Forms of government, unitary and federal, electoral geography, and centripetal, centrifugal, and devolution. Okay, so the types of government. First of all, let's talk about a unitary government. This is when there is a strong central government and they control the weaker state and local government. So you can see that the arrows are only going one direction. This single central government has all of the power and authority. So these regional governments are not allowed to act independently. They're only used to carry out the directions of this central government. And so these systems can be democratic, but most control sits with these people at the top. Some positives here is that there are senses of unity because everything is the same. And in the same vein, oftentimes there's not a lot of misinterpretation of laws and policies because they're the same everywhere. Lastly, there's fewer conflicts between the central and regional governments because all of the power comes from the top. Some negatives is that the central government can become catastrophically large and expensive and inefficient. It may be difficult for that government to keep up with the needs of these localities, and their issues may not be resolved very quickly at all. And then sometimes citizens' voices feel a little limited. And so examples of this are France, Iran, Spain, the United Kingdom, and China. The opposite is a federal government, and this is where there is a strong central government still. However, these regional governments are also strong. And so the official definition here is that powers are divided and shared between the central and regional governments. So that's why the arrows are going both directions. Local governments are given a degree of autonomy, which means that they can act independently in some aspects. So, this is good because citizens feel represented and issues at a local scale are oftentimes given the attention that they need. But some negatives are that there may be conflict between the central and regional governments. There might be a lack of unity with that national government or that central government at the top. And there are different laws and policies everywhere. So Nigeria, the US, Switzerland, and India. And so, as an example of how these powers are shared, let's look at the United States. The US federal government has a lot of powers, which you can see here, but so do our state governments. And then there are powers in between that are shared. Another example of the federal government system is in Nigeria, and you can see that 50% of the people living in Nigeria are Muslim and 40% are Christian. And the federal system allows each sub-state to determine if they would like to institute Sharia or Islamic law. And so you can see on the map that it's about 50-50, the states that institute Sharia law and the states that do not. And so something else that's important is when we're thinking about a federal system, it's important to know how powers are divided because they're divided between a lot of different sub-states and metropolitan forms of government. And so an example for Ohio is that the federal government of the United States is at the top, but then we have the Ohio state government, and then we have the Hamilton County government, and then we have the city of Cincinnati government. And then lastly, we have school districts that have autonomy as well. And so there are several kind of sub-states and then city government levels that also share powers in a federal government system. Okay, so electoral geography. Let's talk about the way that we get voting districts in the United States. So first of all, a census is done every 10 years, and the purpose of this survey that everyone in the United States is required to take is to figure out updated population statistics. Where are people living and how many people are there? And so when the census is done every 10 years, voting districts are reapportioned. And what that means is using the data of the census, seats in the House of Representatives are redistributed based on where the population is. So remember, there are 435 seats in the House of Representatives. And sometimes voting districts have to be moved or shifted, created, or completely eliminated because of a population shift in that country. And so you can see that in 2010, some states gained House seats, while as others lost them. And this is because of population shifts. So once it is determined what those population shifts are and the reapportionment process, we get to redistricting. Redistricting is when those voting districts are actually redone. And there are some legal criteria that have to be followed. So first of all, each voting district has to have an equal population. And then the Supreme Court prefers that they are compact and contiguous. And so what this means is that they're not oddly shaped and that they keep political units, so things like counties, intact together. And then there's also a part of thinking about representational equality of racial and linguistic minorities. So states are also encouraged to redistrict in a way that ensures minority representation. And when we think about who redistricts, it is the state legislature, so the people who are holding political power in the state itself. And so this leads us to gerrymandering. And what this is redistricting for a political advantage to benefit your political party. And so usually whichever political party is controlling the state legislature, they are going to try to create voting districts that benefit their party and get their party more votes. Sometimes this is done with good intentions to provide representation for minorities. And so this is called a majority-minority district. And this is when districts are packed with a majority of the population being a minority. And that's just so minorities can have a voice. However, let's look at this image right here. If you are in a voting district, in a state with, let's say, 50 people, 40% of whom are Republican and 60% are Democratic, you would think that you would only be able to create districts where Democrats prevail because there are more of them. However, that's not true. So if we look here, perfect representation would leave 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. So Democrats would win elections here. And you can see that this is perfectly represented. They have the same population equality, they're compact, and they're contiguous. The second example is compact, but not necessarily fair. It creates a majority of Democrats in each district and leaves the Republicans as a minority. So their votes will basically go wasted. And you can see here that leaves us with 5 blue districts, 0 for red. And so the Democrats would unfairly win here. But here is an unfair redistricting process for Republicans. And so this is neither compact or fair because these really odd districts are created. And the purpose of these districts is to be sure that there are 3 of the Republican districts and only 2 of the Democratic districts, even though that's not what the population actually looks like. Here's another way that you could see redistricting. You just create a majority of a political party in each district to your advantage. Here are Ohio's voting districts, if you're interested in looking and determining if you think any of these are gerrymandered. Okay, so we're on to centripetal, centrifugal forces, and devolution. So centripetal forces are a force or an attitude that unifies people and enhances the support of a state. So they provide stability, they strengthen the state itself, and they bring people together. So I'm going to give you a lot of examples here. Cultural homogeneity, right? This means when people are culturally the same. So if there's one religion or one language, one ethnicity, that is a centripetal force that brings people together. An intense nationalism promoted by like a flag or devotion to a country. External threats can be centripetal forces. So think about like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. That really brought people of our country together to fight against this external force. Charismatic leaders and physical geography are also examples of centripetal forces. A good transportation and communication system in a compact state. and a shared sense of history. So if we think about like the Jewish refugees living in the newly created state of Israel, that's a centripetal force. A strong, effective government, and also natural disasters are centripetal forces because, again, just like external threats, they bring people together to work together and to try to help each other. Centrifugal forces are the exact opposite. They're a force or attitude that divides, weakens, and creates instability. And this can lead to balkanization, which is when a large state breaks into several smaller states. And remember, balkanization is named after the former Yugoslavia, which was broken into smaller autonomous states. This can also lead to devolution, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, or secession. And this is a nation breaking off into an independent state, aside from its original country. And so some examples of centrifugal forces that force people apart are cultural diversity. So when there are multiple religions, languages, ethnicities, nationalities, that forces people apart. Physical geography. So think about if mountains separated one part of a state from another, or if one part of a state, such as the South, is more rural, whereas the North is much more industrial and economically productive. Territorial morphology is also an example of a centrifugal force because people living in fragmented, elongated, and prorupted states are oftentimes isolated because they aren't compact. And economics is also a centrifugal force. So, for example, Catalonia, a region in Spain, is much more economically productive than the rest of the country. And so they don't feel unified. They feel taken advantage of. And so one way that states deal with centrifugal forces is they grant devolution movements a little bit more power. So devolution is a region within a state that demands autonomy or more independence from their central government. And the central government often transfers that power from the central level down to those regional governments to help kind of keep people together. So to prevent balkanization. And so some examples of devolution movements are the former Soviet Union. All of these buffer states in Central Asia and Eastern Europe were granted more and more autonomy before the Soviet Union actually fell apart. The British in India gave the people living in India a little bit more control, and then eventually partitioned India and Pakistan. And the Kashmir in India are an example of a devolution movement as well. The regional autonomy in the United Kingdom of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are examples of devolution movements. They have their own parliaments. And think about Quebec. Remember, Quebec kind of has its own laws and rules and culture aside from the rest of Canada. What's important to know about devolution movements is that they're oftentimes happening on the fringes of states. And you can see all of the devolution movements in Europe here that are illustrated in red. So 3 types of these devolutionary movements. First of all is ethnocultural. And so the example that I have for you here is China is typically dominated by a ethnic group called the Han, and they are Confucianists or atheist. And so Tibetan Buddhists and Uyghurs, who are Muslim, you can see Tibet is here and the Uyghurs live in this section of China, have both kind of fought against the central Chinese government because they have felt not culturally the same as people living in China. And so since they view themselves as culturally distinct, they have developed separately from that country. So they've been given degrees of autonomy by the Chinese government. Another example is economic devolution. So I gave you the example of Catalonia earlier as being more economically productive than the rest of Spain. And Sardinia, which is the territory of Italy, feels like they're economically isolated. Lastly is spatial devolution. This is when regions are really far away from the capital. Maybe they might be exclaves, and they're separated by physical features. So an example of this is definitely Hawaii. Hawaii has been working to become separated from the United States for a very long time.